Welcome everyone to A Brief History, a series where we take a look at the tactics and traditions of civilizations past and present. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the Pre-Marian Reformed faults of the Roman Army under the Roman Republic. I know I described the Roman Army's composition in a wrong way in my last episode. Under normal conditions, a pre-Marian Roman army legion would consist of 10 maniples of hastati, 10 maniples of the principes, and only 5 maniples of the triarii. Now this made it very difficult for Roman generals to increase the number of soldiers in their legion because they had to keep the same composition of soldiers. For every 2 hastati, there had to be 2 principes and then 1 triarii. Now, for an example, let's say that you have a perfect legion of 10 hastati, 10 principes, and 5 triarii. If one of your hastati maniples is killed, you need to quickly get another hastati manipal to take its place. Under no circumstances could a principe manipal take the spot for a hastati manipal because they're 2 different types of units, and it wouldn't work like that. Each infantry type unit is rigorously divided by class in society, how much money you have, and your experience. And we discussed this in the last episode, and it wouldn't work if they started mixing together. So what you basically have to do is somehow either train or take from a different legion another hastati group and put them into your own legion. And on a much bigger scale with much more numbers of soldiers in a legion, it would be very difficult to keep the composition the way it should be, and it is really just a hassle. One thing that many people don't know about the Roman army is that when it first started, when Rome was a very small town, if it was that big, was that the Roman army used a phalanx, which we tend to think of as the Spartan way of fighting, the Greeks, that form of fighting. And when they moved to use regular soldiers, heavy melee infantry, you can still see remnants of that in the triarii. They don't use the phalanx, but they keep their spears as heavy spear infantry. Furthermore, the triarii were not usually used in most Roman battles. In last week's episode, I did dramatize this simply to make the point that they were very good soldiers, but in reality, most of the time, it was the hastati and principes who were fighting all the battles. Obviously, as we know from the triplex axis video, the hastati would go forward, fight. When the commander thought that they were tired, they would retreat. The principes would go forward. Again, once the commander thought they were tired, they would retire and the hastati would re-engage. And this would happen over and over and over until the Romans basically won. This was before the Romans had adapted the line relief system that they had, and it was a centurion-based line relief system in that the centurion in each century commanded their soldiers when to relieve the line and to have a new soldier be the front line. That frontline soldier that is tired goes to the back, and this rotates over and over again on a century level. So not everyone is doing it in the entire legion at the same time. It is century by century. Now you have to remember that the triarii are the wealthiest and the best experienced of the infantry units. So you can imagine that being in the army for a while and not actually fighting, these guys want to fight. They're very good at fighting. They think it's courageous, they think it's brave, and them not being used in battles, very rarely at best, was not very wise. Not only were they great fighters, but in some instances, they would actually charge without being given the orders because they were simply never going to be used anyways. In some extreme cases even, a general had his triarii sit on the ground. They made them sit on the ground during a battle to make sure that they wouldn't get up and run into battle without being given the order. This is how, I guess, bloodthirsty these guys were. Another story that cannot be credited as much as others, so it might not be true, but I like to think it was true, that at one point a group of triarii and a legion were on the point of rebellion. In the next battle, they made the general put them on the front line. So instead of it being hastati principes triarii, it was triarii hastati principes. They basically made him do it. They made him put them, the triarii, up front in the battle, otherwise they would rebel. And even though this story is probably not true, I like to think it is true. I like to think the Triarii as guys who just really want to fight and are bloodthirsty animals. At the time prior to the Marian reforms, each group of soldiers was put into what we call centuries, led by a centurion. Now these were groups of 80 men. Now that was true for the Hastati, for the Principes, and for the Triarii. All three groups had a total of 80 men right before the Marian reforms were put into action. To make it simple, what the Marian reforms did was to put 6 centuries into what was a new battle group called a cohort. Now this would be 6 groups of 80 men for a total of 480 soldiers, which would make up one cohort. As you can see, this is simply 6 groups or centuries of Principes simply in a box formation, but this gives you a much better simplified look at what a cohort is. And remember what they look like for a coming up point. As you can see from that transformation, nothing has really changed between these two groups, as I should call them, except for the fact that the cohort is one single unit of 480 men. Now, as you can tell, they look almost exactly like Principes, which is pretty much what the first legionaries were. It's just a group of 480 Principes. 10 cohorts to a legion, which includes the First Legion, or sometimes called the Eagle Legion, which was considered the best soldiers of the legion and had an extra 200 soldiers to the cohort, taking its total number of soldiers to between 600 and 700 soldiers. And the Romans would still use the triplex axis when they deployed, only obviously on a much, much larger scale. And yes, the Eagle Legion did have a giant golden eagle. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you go check out last week's video where I talked about the triplex axis. Until then, I hope you guys learned something new today. Thanks for watching.